The Atari Lynx was a 16-bit portable gaming handheld capable of scaling and rotation with a color palette of thousands in an age where the black and gray Nintendo Game Boy reigned supreme, and the Sega Game Gear could barely stand a chance. Now, the Lynx was pretty much a failure, but during my brief stint with the underappreciated handheld, I discovered a few games that I loved that I would eventually rediscover on other platforms much later in my life. One such game is Prophecy Viking Child on Nintendo Game Boy. It was just called Viking Child on the Lynx, and the longer title of Prophecy 1, The Viking Child everywhere else, but it's basically the same game no matter where you play. Yeah, some of them are much, much better than the others, but the Game Boy one in particular suffers the most in terms of quality and content. But I can't argue, I'm just glad this version exists at all. And as happy as I am that this game exists on the Game Boy, you can't even take 2 steps without encountering its first problem. The jump and attack buttons are reversed. See, on the NES and the Game Boy, A button should always jump, and B should always attack. By 1991, this wasn't just standard, this was 2D platforming law. If you break this law, you'd better be reinventing the wheel, something Viking Child definitely does not do. Platforming in general, though, feels pretty solid, and our character moves at a nice clip, despite being a little floaty. The controls work well, especially for this kind of game. But check this out. If you land on a platform that's moving horizontally, you have to walk in that direction or you'll fall off. It's a mind-boggling design decision, and it will drive you crazy. Too often you'll be forced to ride on one moving platform, fight a monster, and jump to another moving platform, which, in any other 2D platformer, could be done with just a little bit of skill. Here it's just trial and error over and over, and it's usually luck, not skill, that'll save you. Another problem comes when you have to fight any non-stationary enemy. The hitboxes are totally inaccurate and absolutely unfair. You'll never know how soon or how late to swing your sword, but more often than not, you'll be wrong. So my next tactic was to attack enemies from behind as they're walking away, to give myself a little more wiggle room. But what happens is, when you attack an enemy, they'll get knocked back. They're back, regardless of which direction you're attacking from. Get it? So even if you attack an enemy from behind, they'll get knocked back, into you. It makes no sense, and it's frustrating as hell. And ultimately, you'll just start avoiding as many enemies as possible. It's really the best way to get through this one. One of my favorite things to do in the Lynx version of this game was to explore every cave and crevice, because if you jumped in certain places, hidden coins and loot would just magically appear. It really gave you a great excuse to just take your time instead of running from left to right as quickly as possible. And that doesn't exist at all here. There are plenty of paths to take, and a lot of dead ends, but sadly with no real reward for exploring any of it. The first boss is big, and despite suffering from the same hit detection issues as the rest of the game, it's kind of fun. And once you learn its attack pattern, it's fairly easy too. Make sure you remember that attack pattern, because it is identical to every other boss in the game. They're all about the same size, move at the same speed, and attack then jump after every hit. Honestly, this was probably the easiest part of the game. Yeah, I know, that was a lot of complaints, and I feel like I'm coming down hard on this Game Boy version because I know how great the other versions are, and I can't help wishing that this one was a little bit more similar to those. The Atari Lynx version plays like a stripped-down Wonder Boy in Monsterland, but when you strip down the Atari Lynx version, you're kind of just left with a subpar platformer with hit detection issues and weird moving platforms. But hold on a second. I had captured all the video for this review and then written the whole script when I realized one of the video files didn't save correctly. So I basically had to replay the first half of the game again. So I went in and I started from scratch, but knowing what I had already learned. And it was way easier. I knew my way through the levels, yes, but I also learned something about the combat. It's still super finicky, but if you attack, retreat, your odds of landing each hit improve dramatically. Maybe I just knew what to expect, but my second playthrough was actually really fun. So I guess it's not all bad news after all. The graphics here are really good, and each level has its own look. And for the Game Boy, the music works really well too. Oh, did I mention there's no sound effects?